Now that we have defined the three major branches of most democratic governments, I want to make a distinction between how these governments function, because they don't all function the same. If you look at the orange things on this map, you can see that there are various democracies that are presidential democracies. And then if you look at the yellow, those are examples of parliamentary democracies. Hi, Lucy. What exactly does that mean? Well, let me explain a parliamentary system. And what I'll say is, in a parliamentary system, when you have an election, and we'll talk more about election systems in the next video, but when you have an election, you vote and you determine who are the members of parliament. Let's say we have an election in which this is the result. There are the majority of people, 60 votes, 60 seats go to the blue party, but also there's some members from the black party, some from the red party, some from the green party, and they all are seated in parliament. Well, in this scenario that I laid out for you, there's a clear majority. So the blue party is in the majority after the election. What they do, one of their first orders of business, is to elect a leader, right? That leader is going to be called the prime minister in a parliamentary system, right? They will be chosen by their party, and they'll be in charge. And to use the language that we just used, they will be the executive, right? They are head of the executive branch, whereas the parliament is the legislative branch. And so I want to make something very clear here. There was no separate election for the prime minister, right? It's not like in our system where we have separate elections for the Congress and for the president. It's just this one election for the parliament, and then the members of the parliament choose their prime minister. To be very clear, when people are voting for their, for whatever party they want to be in parliament, they know who the prime minister will be. There will be a publicly pronounced head of party, and you know that if the blue party wins a majority of seats in parliament, that means Mr. Leff will be the prime minister in Leffistan. Name recognition is big in Leffistan, and so that helps. I'll have to stop for a second. One of the things that the prime minister gets to do is what's called form their government. That is, they choose a whole cabinet. Sometimes these are called secretaries in our system. We could talk about, they often in Europe talk about ministers. There's a minister of labor, Rob, a minister of defense, Bianca, a minister of trade, Sophia, a minister of education, Charlotte, and you all. These are all pictures that are for free on the internet, so it's your fault that I was able to find them. Anyway, I put this cabinet together, and we oversee various aspects of policy, and in turn, and all these people, as you can see here, are drawn from the blue party. These would all be loyal party members who I would appoint to these important posts, and we'd have, hopefully, an effective government. All right. So a key thing to understand about parliamentary systems is prime ministers are often quite powerful in these systems. I mean, if you can think about it, by definition, the prime minister is from the same party as the party that's in the majority, right? If there's a party in the majority, they will elect their leader as the prime minister, so they're always in step. And we'll talk about this in a sec, but think about how that's different from a presidential system, right? The majority and the president aren't always on the same team, but in parliamentary systems they are. Typically, members of the cabinet will always support the prime minister, certainly in public. It's general tradition. If there are major differences of opinion, if Sophia is fed up with my leadership, she'll resign from the cabinet. And generally, until she does that, she'll stay supportive of my policies. Similarly, political scientists who study this would note that typically party line voting, that is everyone in one party voting the same way, tends to be more common in parliamentary systems like this one, for reasons that we might eventually get to. Basically, the members of parliament know that they rely on the party leadership for their positions of influence. Oh, I'll have to get Lucy. For their positions of influence, and therefore they are pretty reliable voters. I'll just have to finish this with Lucy on my lap. So what I want to make clear is I was saying, the prime minister tends to have a lot of power. And that doesn't mean they never have any trouble. If you were following Brexit a year ago, for a long time, Theresa May really struggled to get members of her party to support her plans for Brexit. And it is possible to oust a prime minister. That is, there is such a thing as a vote of no confidence. That is, if the parliament, I don't know if it's a simple majority or a bigger majority, it might vary in the place. But anyway, a parliament can basically make a vote of no confidence, and that will lead the prime minister to step down, and there would be new elections. This is sort of like impeachment, but it's far more common. You don't have to be guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors. It can just be that they're fed up with your leadership and the policies you pursued. They'll throw you out. And that happens fairly regularly. And as such, in parliamentary systems, elections aren't necessarily just like cleanly every 4 years or every 2 years like in our system. They happen at somewhat random times. It'll just be like, oh, they called an election for the second time in 18 months. And to us, that seems weird, but that's actually quite common in a lot of parliamentary systems. Now, let me give you one more scenario to think about in terms of how a parliamentary system might work. I gave you a simple case of the Parliament of Lefistan having a majority of members that are in the Blue Party. But what if it were different? It won't always be the case for reasons we'll ultimately discuss. Sometimes there are so many parties that no one gets the majority. In this case, you can see Blue Party is still the biggest party, but there's also the white and green and black and red parties, right, who all end up having substantial seats in Parliament. If no one has the majority, what happens? Do any of you know? Well, the answer is that they form what is called a coalition. A coalition means that members of different parties all agree to get together and form kind of a ruling majority, right? The blue, the white, and the green would all perhaps get on the same team. Perhaps the blue, the white, and the green parties have some ideological similarity. Maybe they're both on the left wing or right wing of the political spectrum. But generally, they are able to get together and form a majority who can in turn elect a prime minister who forms a government. In this scenario, I will say that I retain my space as prime minister. As leader of the Blue Party, which has the most seats in parliament, I was the one who was able to form this coalition, and so I stay prime minister, and that's typically what happens in coalitions, is that the leader of the biggest party is the prime minister. However, when I make my cabinet, I might do it slightly differently. Yes, I might still have Bianca as my Minister of Defense and Charlotte as my Minister of Education, but maybe I'll have to take Sasha as my Minister of Trade and Elizabeth as my Minister of Labor, someone from the White Party and the Green Party. This might have been part of the negotiations to form the coalition that, the White Party will only join if several of their people get to be cabinet ministers for me. And so this is actually a fairly common arrangement, and we'll talk about why in the next video. But when there are a bunch of different parties, it's often hard for one party to have the majority. What this means is that situations like this, the prime minister has a little less power than he or she would if a single party had the majority, because it's a more fragile coalition. All right? If the Green and White Party get fed up with me, they could join with the Black and Red Party and have a vote of no confidence and oust me. So this is potentially harder work for me to keep everyone on the same team voting for the same legislation. However, the White and the Green still have some incentive to play ball. After all, right now they are small parties who are nevertheless in the ruling coalition. That's good for them. So that's the balance. Anyway, that is how a parliamentary system. Now let me move on and talk about the presidential system. This is the one we're familiar with, and you can see it's common in much of the Americas, interestingly. But in a presidential system, it works like this. There is the executive branch. Instead of a prime minister, you have a president, and then you still have a legislature. We typically call it a Congress. The president is very similar to the prime minister in that they're in charge of the executive branch and so forth. They fulfill a lot of similar functions, but there are some important differences. I won't go into all of them, but here are a couple of them. One, it's a completely separate election process. Right? It's not like in a parliamentary system where you elect the parliament and they elect the executive. Instead, we have these separate elections. We vote on our Congress people in one election. We vote on the president in a different election. Very much related to this, there is separation of powers. Right? Basically, there are certain things that the party in control of Congress gets to decide, and certain things that the party in charge of the presidency gets to decide. This is something that is often results in the same party being in control of Congress and of the presidency, but not always. And if you think about that, right, that can have big results. Like, think about what happens if the party that controls Congress and the party that controls the presidency are different. Think about what would happen. In fact, this did happen under much of the Obama administration. Right? It did happen recently when the Democrats got control of the House of Representatives. You can have a lot of fighting and gridlock. That is, right now, right? It can be hard to pass legislation. If you're Donald Trump or Mitch McConnell in charge of the Senate Republicans, it can be hard to get through what you want because the Democrats control the House and they could stop that legislation, right? A scenario, we could have a scenario like we did under the Obama administration where the Republicans controlled both houses of Congress, even though a Democrat, Obama, controlled the presidencies. And therefore, the Republicans could pass legislation after piece of legislation after piece of legislation, and Obama just kept vetoing it all the time, right? And that's a scenario that just would be exceedingly rare in a parliamentary system, right? The parliamentary system, the people in charge of parliament and the people in charge of who is the prime minister, like that's the same party. And so you don't have the prime minister vetoing what the parliament does. That can absolutely happen in a presidential system where those two things, right, the executive and the legislative branches are sometimes at cross purposes. So I won't go through it here, but I gave you some examples already. I wonder if you can think of other examples, and we may be able to talk about this in class, of ways in which the executive and the legislative branch can act as having veto power over each other, can kind of block what each other wants to do. I wonder if you can think of any concrete examples of that happening. Right. So anyway, we've talked about our parliamentary system versus our presidential system. The U.S. is presidential.